If you read or hear that the Pilgrims were greedy Europeans intent on building empires on land stolen from the Indians, or were enslavers or murderers, just know that you're reading outright lies. These Puritans were so deeply resolved to die to themselves as Jesus commanded that even their most private sins were considered egregious. Their aim was always to further the gospel of Jesus Christ through the raising of godly children, the covenant of the church, the building of a strong community with rules and laws based in the scriptures, and the evangelism of the Indians. Thanksgiving is so much more than a family feast day centered around turkey and football and perhaps Black Friday shopping plans. This holiday represents the start of a brand new kind of country, one that never existed in world history up until that time. It set the stage for religious freedom, political freedom, and an entirely new kind of church, because that little group of pilgrims who sailed on the Mayflower in 1620 was a drop in an ocean that sent ripples down through the centuries, and we still benefit today from what they started over 400 years ago. I hope to impress on you the enormity of what those pilgrims did for the church in America, in church history, and what would become the freest nation on earth. Thanksgiving is a holiday steeped in Americana and Christianity. And today I'm going to talk about several things, namely the importance of the Thanksgiving holiday, the impact that the Puritans had on our country, and also the myths of the Pilgrims that most kids are actually taught in school today. And I'm going to end this episode with a little bit of talk about Christian nationalism. I want to push back today on the modern notion that the Pilgrims were nothing but white Indian killers who only wanted free land. Do you know why? Why do we know this? Because they documented everything they did. They documented the reasons for doing these things, and they freely admitted both their shortcomings and their victories. They came to this land solely for religious freedom. They respected and feared the Indians, and they willingly learned from them. They were helpless and weak and ignorant of this new land, and they depended on God and the generosity of the Indians to get them through the first very difficult years. They learned many lessons, and they shared those lessons with future generations by carefully writing everything down in letters, journals, pamphlets, and even published books. So let's back up in history just a little bit to prepare the scene for this pilgrim migration. Because the Plymouth Colony is America's entrance into church history. Have you ever thought about that? Did you know that the American founding is a direct result of the Protestant Reformation? Between the 12th and 16th centuries, there was a fire spreading through Europe as men rose up to speak out against the powers of the Roman Catholic Church. They protested a works-based Christianity that required payments and rituals to save their souls and the souls of their family members. These men believed that the common people should have access to the Bible in their own language instead of Latin, which was only the language of the educated elite. And if they could read the Bible in their own language, they would see for themselves that salvation is from Christ alone, through faith alone. Men like Wycliffe, Tyndale, Luther, Knox, and many others risked their lives in protest in what would become called the Protestant Reformation. This was a time when religious liberty was non-existent. There were men and women resisting the church's authority and even dying for doing so. You'll read about this in many different, some of these stories are even covered in Fox's Book of Martyrs. Now, this was happening all across Europe between the 1300s to the 1500s. And our story begins in England. So the English reformers that we know today were John Wycliffe and William Tyndale. And under King Henry VIII, something interesting happened. He was married to his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, but he wanted a divorce. He actually wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. Well, the Pope said no, and the Pope had the power because he was the head of the church, and the Roman Catholic Church was a church-state institution. So whatever they said was law. Henry VIII found a clever way to use the Protestant Reformation to his advantage. He was not an actual reformer. So he began reading the writings of Tyndale, who wrote openly about the differences between the Catholic Church's practices and what the New Testament church ought to look like. And he openly declared that the Bible was the authority for all men to follow and not the church. Tyndale said this, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spare my life, ere many years I will cause a boy who drives the plow to know more of the scriptures than you do." This was a treasonous statement to defy the Pope openly. In fact, Tyndale was betrayed into the hands of the authorities and tried as a heretic, and at the age of 42 he was strangled to death and then burned. But his last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes," and his prayer was answered. King Henry VIII continued to read Tyndale's writings, and this, coupled with his own personal desire for a divorce, compelled him to split from the church in Rome. This was a huge step for England. By 1535, King Henry commissioned an official English translation of the Bible and founded the Church of England. Remember, King Henry VIII was not a reformer, but I believe that God works in mysterious ways. But the Church of England was still very much like the Roman Catholic Church in many of its practices. This included the heavy hand of the church state. Because the King or Queen of England was also the head of the Church of England, they forced religious practices on their subjects and punished anyone who did not conform. So it's difficult for us in America to even fathom this. But the Catholic Church and the Church of England were the only legal churches in their lands. The people had no choice but to attend these services only and to worship according to the strict and numerous rules created by their leaders. All of this was enforced by law because in both situations, the church and the state were combined. I think you can see why the American patriots insisted on freedom of religion. Because of this, a new movement rose up, especially among the English Christians. These Englishmen wanted to purify the Church of England from within and return to a simple, straightforward practice like the New Testament church. And for this, they were nicknamed Puritans. They hoped to work within the Church of England to bring about this change. Not only were these Puritans the beneficiaries of the Reformation, but they often had fathers and grandfathers who were actively involved in the Reformation movement itself. So their roots ran deep. Now, besides the Puritans, there was a much smaller, more radical subset of Puritans who believed that the only real pathway to free worship was through separation from the church. And so they earned the nickname separatists. The church authorities were more suspect of this group because of their open rebellion. Fast forward to 1603, when King James I took the throne, the separatists became outlaws. They were arrested and imprisoned and had their possessions confiscated. They began to meet for worship in secret, and when the persecution became too great, they sought a way out of England. So many of the groups actually left for Holland, where there was more religious freedom. After 12 years in Holland, some of these separatists decided that a new land would be more suitable to their purpose, and they chose to take the journey across the Atlantic Ocean to the American wilderness. And we know these people as the Pilgrims. William Bradford became the governor of the Plymouth colony. That lasted for about 30 years, and he wrote a book called Of Plymouth Plantation. And in this book, he details the history of the Pilgrims from England to Holland and then to America, and for many, many years in their new settlement in America. And here's one of the things that he wrote about leaving Holland. The one party of reformers endeavored to establish the right worship of God and the discipline of Christ in the church according to the simplicity of the gospel and without the mixture of men's inventions, and to be ruled by the laws of God's word dispensed by such officers as pastors, teachers, elders, etc., according to the scriptures. The other party, the Episcopal, under many pretenses, endeavored to maintain the episcopal dignity after the popish manner, with all its courts, canons, and ceremonies, its livings, revenues, subordinate officers, and other means of upholding their anti-Christian greatness, and of enabling them with lordly and tyrannous power to persecute the poor servants of God. The flight was so bitter that neither the honor of God, the persecution to which both parties were subjected, nor the mediation of Mr. Calvin and other worthies could prevail with the Episcopal party. They proceeded by all means to disturb the peace of this poor, persecuted church of dissenters, even so far as to accuse, very unjustly and ungodly, some of its chief members with rebellion and high treason against the emperor and other such crimes. So that is a very clear explanation of why these separatists had to separate from the Church of England. This and a ton more information is available in this book written by William Bradford called Of Plymouth Plantation. Now, for a moment, I'd like to talk about the Pilgrims and the awfully bad information that people have and the truth. Because in the 20th century and the 21st century, historians have invested a great deal of time in what is called revisionist history. That means changing the story of great people and civilizations to fit what they think happened and why they believe it happened or didn't happen, or telling what they think should have happened. There is a definite bias, and the divide is right down the middle between Christians and non-Christians. I've talked about this quite a bit in a previous podcast, including one about Christopher Columbus and the way his history is taught, as well as an episode with Mary Graybar, who has written a couple of books about the Howard Zinn effect on American history. So I hope you'll go back and listen to those too. But I want to read a snippet from an article called Academic Standards Promoting Islam Invaded America's Classrooms. This is from 2015, and Dr. Susan Berry stated this. With regard to world history, Donna Hearn, former Reagan official in the U.S. Department of Education, says as far back as the 1930s, there was a movement to collect and write curriculum that would be hostile to America. The Frankfurt School, which was the source of critical theory, was developed with the goal of advancing Marxist philosophy in Germany. Following the Nazi takeover, the Frankfurt School eventually moved to New York and Columbia University. And just in case you're not aware, Columbia University is one of the biggest teacher colleges in the nation. This is why I talk a lot about cultural Marxism on my blog and on my podcast, because this is what has affected the American history education all across the country. In another report that's called The Stealth Curriculum by Sandra Stotsky, an investigation into many history curricula shows that there is a definite revision of history, especially American, taught to our public school children today. The use of supplemental resources like websites and professional workshops excludes history curriculum from scrutiny and oversight because no two school districts or history teachers are presenting material in the same way. And large numbers of history teachers are actually not trained to teach history, leaving them to accept any instructional materials for their classroom without verifying the facts. I have a link to this full article on my website, and I'll include it in the description, but I want to share a couple more excerpts from it that illustrate the problem with history instruction in America. Quote, "We do know that teachers have been increasingly encouraged by their professional organizations to use videos of television programs or films in their classes to compensate for the inability of many high school students to read their history textbooks or primary documents with adequate comprehension. Also, the daily lives and fates of the many Native American tribes have been perhaps the greatest beneficiary of this socio-cultural approach, which now occupies much instructional time. With it, however, comes a strongly negative view of the Europeans who explored and colonized the Americas. Supplemental resources now guide teachers to downplay or ignore altogether what students should be learning about the origins and development of our civic culture. I just want to tell you that this has been verified to me numerous times by public school teachers, and I have been watching as it is creeping into homeschool curriculum as well. And one more quote from that article. Appendix C contains the most manipulative set of teacher-created lessons. It has not one academic objective. Instead of the Wampanoags, the lesson should have been titled How to Cultivate Hatred of the Pilgrims. The teacher clearly intends to make sure her students end up with no, quote, misconceptions about the Pilgrims, even grading them for parroting the politically correct response. This is not history instruction. This is clearly indoctrination. And the result of this is a generation of people who find history dry and boring and who are ashamed to be Americans. They view capitalism as evil. They view American exceptionalism as a crime. They see our founders not as heroes and wise men, but as tyrants, greedy land grabbers, Indian killers, and slaveholders. And the Pilgrims are completely misunderstood when they're taught at all. I've been told by numerous public school teachers that they are often instructed to avoid using the word pilgrim or that they must gloss over the first Thanksgiving story because it's too controversial. Thank goodness for primary resources. These primary sources are the writings of the people who made and witnessed history. Things like diaries, autobiographies, books, letters, and official documents. In the case of the Pilgrims, the Mayflower Compact is an official document, but it is explained further by the writings of William Bradford, John Winthrop, and many others who signed it and lived it. The day-to-day lives of these pilgrims, including why they sailed to the New World, how they got their start, the relations with the various Indian tribes, the religious beliefs and practices, and the amazing beginnings of American democracy are all detailed in multiple first-hand accounts. So let's go back to 1620 and the separatists for just a moment. Remember, they first left England for Holland, but life in their new home was difficult. They were foreigners, the work was hard, they had not succeeded in establishing businesses or trade, and their children were growing more worldly thanks to the influences of the culture. And so they began to turn their thoughts to the New World. There was much talk of Virginia at this time since the Jamestown colony had been established in 1607. This seemed like the perfect place to make a new start. And so, as devout Christians seeking God's will in every step they took, the separatists prayed for guidance. Again, William Bradford writes this: "It was answered that all great and honorable actions are accompanied with great difficulties, and must be enterprised and overcome with answerable courages. It was granted that the dangers were great, but not desperate, and the difficulties were many, but not invincible. They had heard some horror stories from the Jamestown colony, but all of them, through the help of God, by fortitude and patience, knew that they might either be borne or overcome. But their condition was not ordinary. Their ends were good and honorable, their calling was lawful and urgent, and therefore they might expect the blessing of God in their proceeding. Yea, though they should lose their lives in this action, yet they might have comfort in the same, and their endeavors would be honorable." Again, that's from the book of Plymouth Plantation by William Bradford. So they determined to sail to the New World. They negotiated a charter to help with the expenses, and a ship called the Speedwell was purchased to take them to Southampton, where they would join the Mayflower for the voyage across the Atlantic. Before they departed, they received a letter from their beloved pastor John Robinson, who had stayed behind with the main congregation in Holland. And this letter was read to the departing Puritans. This is such an interesting letter, and I just want to read a small tidbit for you. His admonition would echo into the future of a nation that they could not even fathom. He said this: "Whereas you are to become a body politic, using amongst yourselves civil government, and are not furnished with any people of special eminence above the rest, like no nobility, they would have to choose their leaders from among equals. Let your wisdom and godliness appear not only in choosing such persons as do entirely love and will promote the common good, but also in yielding unto them all due honor and obedience in their lawful administrations." It actually gives me chills to read this letter that was written over 400 years ago, because they were being instructed to form a civil government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And among the many colonies of New England in the 17th century, the Plymouth colony was one of the most peaceful, the most successful, and the most influential in American history. And I firmly believe it was because the Puritans had a profound influence on everything around them. But how do we know this? As I said earlier, we know it from primary sources. I told you about the book written by William Bradford of Plymouth Plantation. It covers the years 1620 to 1646, and he tells the story in his own words of the Pilgrims' life in England, then Holland, and their journey to America. By the time he tells of their Thanksgiving celebration, you will be thanking God right along with the Pilgrims for such basic gifts as corn and fish and rain. Now, since this book was written in the 1600s, the language is not the easy English of today. It is suitable for the whole family, but I would say the reading level is teenagers and adults. In my opinion, though, there is no better history book about the Pilgrims. Additionally, the Pilgrims kept a journal of their first year at Plymouth, and they sent it back to England as a report. It's known as Mort's Relation. And while Bradford's narrative presents us with a detailed history of the Pilgrims, this smaller journal is the short version. As Americans fall prey to confusion surrounding the truth about the Pilgrims, about the Puritans, about their intent, and their relationship with the Indians, you can actually own the truth in printed form. As I tell my own kids and my history students in various co-ops, the internet is not your friend when it comes to history fact, but the old texts are still alive, and whether we like what happened or not, we can know the truth. That's why I founded Knowledge Keepers Bookstore, to make these texts affordable, easy to access, and to preserve them in home libraries. And so that short version is in this book, The First Year at Plymouth Plantation. This is just one of 20 books in the Knowledge Keepers collection, and this one has additional commentary, footnotes, and illustrations. And it's a very affordable $11.99 on Amazon, and so I'll link that below as well. Now, just a couple more things I want to point out about the Puritans. Let's look at them as parents. In Plymouth Plantation, William Bradford described several reasons for leaving Holland. He actually gave a list, and on that list was this. He said, "But still more lamentable, and of all sorrows most heavily to be borne, was that many of the children, influenced by difficult physical conditions and the great licentiousness of the young people of the country, and the many temptations of the city, were led by evil example into dangerous courses, getting the reins off their necks and leaving their parents. Some became soldiers, others embarked upon voyages by sea, and others upon worse courses, tending to dissoluteness and the danger of their souls, to the great grief of the parents and the dishonor of God. So they saw their posterity would be in danger to degenerate and become corrupt." And as Christians as a whole, you can read this all throughout their writings, but they were not the gloomy disciplinarians that history has made them out to be. In 1630, over 1,000 Puritans immigrated to the New World to settle near the Plymouth colony. If you remember, there were Puritans and there were Separatists, and the Separatists had become the Pilgrims. When you read the writings of these Plymouth Pilgrims, you get a very good sense of their deep Christian faith. They were devoted to daily scripture reading, praying, church attendance, and living out the principles in the Bible. They were strict with themselves in terms of behavior, so much so that they have a reputation now for being gloomy and unhappy, but this is not true. They were happy. They played games. They held feasts. They worked and traded together as friends. They enjoyed singing in each other's company, and all while seeking to glorify God in everything they did. If you're unfamiliar with these American Puritans, I have a book recommendation for you. It's called The American Puritans by Dustin Benge and Nate Pickowicz. It's very enlightening, easy read, and it's great for high schoolers and adults. Now, the Puritans, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this podcast, had such an influence on American colonies and the society. Their influence cannot be overstated, and that's what the main gist of this podcast is about. Those Puritans set the standard for society and government that lasted for more than 200 years and in many ways still exists today. It started with the Mayflower Compact. When the Pilgrims made anchor in Plymouth Harbor, they had actually sailed off course from their original destination, which was Virginia. They were outside the geographic boundaries of the Virginia Charter that they had agreed to, which put them outside the governance and protection of anyone. So their solution was to pen an agreement that set the stage for a future revolution and a uniquely American government. But their goal was immediate. What do we do when we get off this boat? Who's going to be in charge? And so they created a covenant. The Mayflower Compact reads, "In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God of Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, and the honor of our King and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof do enact, constitute and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and officers from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience, in witness whereof we have hereunto subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, 1620. Soon after this, Massachusetts Bay Colony was founded by Governor Winthrop, a successful lawyer and strong Puritan. He led over 700 Puritans in 11 ships from England for religious freedom. Among his many written works is a model of Christian charity, which became a guideline for the constitutional covenants of the colonies. In it he wrote, quote, "We are a company professing ourselves fellow members of Christ, knit together by this bond of love. We are entered into covenant with him for this work. For we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. So that if we shall deal falsely with our God in this work we have undertaken, and so cause him to withdraw his present help from us, we shall be made a story and a byword through the world." Well, that didn't happen. They did become a city on a hill, and they have left such a strong legacy. In 1636, the Plymouth colony wrote their first book of laws, which introduced the basic foundation for a republic, like the election of leaders and term limits, etc. This legal code was updated multiple times, and you can actually read it in a book called The Laws of the Pilgrims by John D. Cushing. It was published in 1977, and I will link that below also. Another book that I highly recommend is The Origins of American Constitutionalism by Donald S. Lutz. And in this book, he states several things that I want to share with you. Quote, "Local self-government came to North America out of necessity. The Mayflower Compact was written, as I told you, because they had veered off course and were no longer under the protection of the Virginia Charter. So this necessity, this self-government, I'm going to go on and read what he said. It was soon made a virtue. The one thing that these largely Calvinist settlers brought with them that was admirably suited to the circumstances was their familiarity with religious covenants as the basis for forming communities." He goes on to talk about the centrality of religion in their lives, and that almost the first thing many colonies did was to covenant a church among themselves. Wherever dissenting Protestantism went, so too went their church covenants. These church covenants were naturally the model that government covenants were based on. This is a really fascinating book and well worth space on your bookshelf. Lutz also points out, quote, "Viewing the United States Constitution as the critical expression of the American Constitution, we move back in time, seeking the less differentiated and more embryonic expression of what is in that document. Our search takes us to the earliest state constitutions, then to colonial documents of foundation that are essentially constitutional, such as the Pilgrim Code of Law, and then to proto-constitutions such as the Mayflower Compact." This part is very interesting. The political covenants written by English colonists in America lead us to the church covenants written by radical Protestants in the late 15 and 1600s, and these in turn lead us back to the covenant tradition of the Old Testament. The American constitutional tradition derives in much of its form and content from the Judeo-Christian tradition as interpreted by the radical Protestant sects to which belong so many of the original European settlers in British North America. He goes on to continue this line of thought by pointing out the importance of virtue in the colonies. And if you read the writings of any of America's leaders from the 1600s and 1700s, you will see the word virtue used hundreds of times. And Lutz correctly sums it up by saying virtue meant following God's laws as found in the Bible. And so you might hear people talk about, well, they were moral people, they were deists, they were somewhat religious. No, they were Christians. And again, as he says, virtue to them meant following God's laws as found in the Bible. This is a very important statement, and it's very unique to the American colonies. It's also directly related to the Revolution and the Constitution. So over the rest of the 1600s, the colonies continued to grow and spread, and so did Puritanism. While not every colony was a Puritan colony, they were most certainly Protestant and Calvinist, with the exception of Maryland. Numerous colonial charters, government documents, and later constitutions reflect the strong Christian principles that laid the foundation for these colonies. I encourage you to go and look up different charters and constitutions and read the wording, especially from the first 13 colonies, and see what they said about the propagation of the gospel and serving of Jesus Christ. They were not mincing words in those documents. Before we move on from the Pilgrims, I want to point out a couple of Pilgrim myths that have been mistaken for fact in this modern age of revisionist history. In fact, I have just 3 today. The first myth is that the Pilgrims stole from the Indians and killed the Indians. Nope, nope, nope. The Pilgrims and the Wampanoags had decades of peaceful relations, and they mutually traded and worked together. The only time Pilgrims fought Indians was when they were in alliance with the Wampanoag tribe against the enemies of the Wampanoag tribe. Indians were fighting Indians for hundreds of years. They were not immune to murder and warfare. And so when different European settlers would come over, they often would form an alliance with one tribe, and that meant that they would be fighting other tribes. So you need to read the details and read the stories in context. Another myth is that the first Thanksgiving was not a peaceful event and the Wampanoags were not invited guests. But William Bradford literally wrote what happened, and we can trust his account because his journal has been verified by many other Pilgrim writers. It's all in the book, guys. All you have to do is read it. And the third myth is that the Pilgrims believed God commanded them to adopt democracy as their form of government, and that government should enforce religious belief. This myth is straight from the New England Historical Society. The Pilgrims didn't believe that God commanded them to adopt democracy. What they did believe in was freedom. And as I've already explained, they had escaped religious persecution, and they wanted to create a safe haven from that. They did believe that God created humans to live in freedom, and that it was beneficial to elect men to offices of government who believed the same thing. I mentioned this earlier, but their idea of virtue came from the Bible. They were not imposing a religion. They were creating a society. Remember the covenants? And that society was based on the fundamentals of the Judeo-Christian religion. By the way, that myth is from the New England Historical Society, and I say shame on them for mangling the truth so horribly when they certainly have access to all the primary sources. So what were the Puritans like? What did they believe? I want to read to you just a few short quotes from the Puritans. Thomas Tuke said, "If a man's love is directed toward God, his life will reflect that goodness." John Durant said, "Afflictions are sent and sanctioned to bring us to Christ because often nothing else will." Josiah Shute said, "True repentance is when a man grieves for his sin to the extent that he abandons it." Timothy Crusoe said, "Idleness is an ideal soil for sins to grow and thrive in." John Maynard said, "Self-abasing is the lifting up of Christ." If you read or hear that the Pilgrims were greedy Europeans intent on building empires on land stolen from the Indians, or were enslavers or murderers, just know that you're reading outright lies. These Puritans were so deeply resolved to die to themselves as Jesus commanded that even their most private sins were considered egregious. Their aim was always to further the gospel of Jesus Christ through the raising of godly children, the covenant of the church, the building of a strong community with rules and laws based in the scriptures, and the evangelism of the Indians. Let's move forward to the Great Awakening. Now, in the early 1700s, as hard as it may be to believe, the population of the colonies was actually drifting from these strong Christian roots. Not anything like we see today in the 21st century, but it was a societal shift until something called the Great Awakening. I hope that you are familiar with names like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. These were the two most famous preachers of the Great Awakening, and this took place from the 1730s through the 1760s. Now, if you know anything about American history, you know that this is going to lead up to the 1770s, which is when the Revolution started. For some context, George Washington was born in 1732, and many of his contemporaries were also born around this same time, 1730s through 1760s. Think about that as I go on. These two preachers and several others began preaching revival services all up and down the colonies. They preached thousands of sermons in churches and fields where hundreds and thousands of people would gather. And I'm talking about 30 years of revival. David Barton says in his book, The American Story, As a result, thousands were converted to Christianity and churches were filled. Today, this movement is often characterized as a national revival. However, it was really thousands of local revivals in so many communities across America that eventually the entire nation was changed. That is, the revival grew from families and towns outward to the nation, not from the nation inward to towns and families. I want to repeat that last part. The revival grew from families and towns outward to the nation, not from the nation inward to towns and families. Stay tuned for the last part of this podcast where I'm going to apply that to Christian nationalism. So if the Great Awakening spanned 30 years from the 1730s to the 1760s, it's no surprise what an impact it had on the thinking of the colonists who were growing up during that time in the years leading up to the Revolution. If George Washington and many of his contemporary patriots grew up their whole lives in a time called the Great Awakening, a national revival, you can understand that they had a zeal for biblical principles and they were watching the growing tyranny of the King of England. And so ideas like consent of the governed and resistance to tyrants is obedient to God became very common and natural themes. It's important to remember the strong relationship between the Christian religion and civil government that was normal practice in the colonies. Now, everyone has probably heard that the colonists said, "No more kings," but it was actually more than that. A famous revolutionary rallying cry became, "No king but King Jesus." I want to read to you a short story. On April 18th, 1775, John Adams and John Hancock were at the home of Reverend Jonas Clark. British General Gage had announced to the colonists that if they would lay down their arms, all would be forgiven, except for Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were singled out as instigators. That same night, Paul Revere arrived at Reverend Clark's home to warn them that the Redcoats were approaching. The very next morning, British Major Pitcairn shouted to an assemblage regiment of Minutemen, the American Patriots, "Disperse, you villains! Lay down your arms in the name of George, the sovereign King of England." Reverend Clark responded with what is known as the battle cry of the American Revolution. "We recognize no sovereign but God and no king but Jesus." And Reverend Clark became the leader of the militia in Lexington. Jonathan Mayhew, pastor of the West Church in Boston, said this: "It is evident that the affair of civil government may properly fall under a moral and religious consideration. For although there be a sense, and a very plain and important sense, in which Christ's kingdom is not of this world, his inspired apostles have nevertheless laid down some general principles concerning the office of civil rulers, and the duty of subjects, together with the reason and obligation of that duty. And it is proper for all who acknowledge the authority of Jesus Christ and the inspiration of his apostles to endeavor to understand what is in fact the doctrine which they have delivered concerning this matter. Civil tyranny is usually small at the beginning, like the drop of a bucket, till at length, like a mighty torrent or the raging waves of the sea, it bears down all before it and deluges whole countries and empires." The Patriots argued that freedom was a gift from God, and not one to be bestowed by governments, only defended by governments. And they repeatedly wrote and spoke on this fact that without the Christian religion undergirding that freedom, it could not last. Samuel Adams, who is one of my favorite patriots, was the founder of the Sons of Liberty and the leader of the Boston Tea Party. And he said this: "The right to freedom is the gift of God Almighty. The rights of the colonists as Christians may be best understood by reading and carefully studying the institutes of the great lawgiver and head of the Christian church, which are to be found clearly written and promulgated in the New Testament." George Washington repeatedly noted in his diary of fasting and praying for God's direction and intervention in the cause of liberty. He also wrote down each instance where he believed God had miraculously intervened in the war against England. By the way, that's not the action of a deist. Deists believe that God created the world and since then has no further interest in what happens on earth. Deists will not fast and pray for God's intervention. So what was this Puritan effect? There are too many facets to the Puritan lifestyle to even cover here, but considering the effect of strong families with godly leaders, a population intent on self-discipline, a biblical worldview of literally everything, and a community that was built around a church covenant, Cotton Mather was one of the most prominent American Puritans, and he said this: "Well-ordered families naturally produce a good order in society." Again, I'm hinting at what I believe to be Christian nationalism. The Puritan era stretched over 2 centuries in America, illustrating what a strong influence they had through their families and ultimately in society. And while not all the colonists were Puritans, the impact of their beliefs on their numerous communities was so powerful that it can be seen all the way into the 1800s. They influenced education for the first 2 centuries of American history by putting a heavy emphasis on teaching children to read for the express purpose of knowing the scriptures. In fact, the school system in America began with the Puritans in Massachusetts, who passed what was called the Old Deluder Satan Act in 1647. It says this: "It being one chief project of that old deluder, Satan, to keep men from the knowledge of the scriptures, as in former times, keeping them in an unknown tongue, so in these later times, by persuading them from the use of those tongues, that so at least the true sense and meaning of the original might be clouded by false glosses of saint-seeming deliverers, and that learning may not be buried in the graves of our forefathers in church and commonwealth. The Lord assisting our endeavors, it is therefore ordered by this court and authority thereof, that every township in this jurisdiction, after the Lord has increased them to the number of 50 households, shall then forthwith appoint one within their town to teach all such children as shall resort to him to write and read." The New England Primer, the first reader in America, was an ABC catechism meant to teach children to read with the words of the scriptures. This little book, the New England Primer, was used for around 100 years, maybe longer, in the American colonies. And this was to set the tone for American education for many, many years. The Puritans also founded many of the first colleges and universities in America, including names like Harvard and Yale and Dartmouth. And each of them was founded for the purpose of knowing the scriptures. For many years, state constitutions clearly stated that the purpose of education was for the teaching of morals and religions. Again, I tell you, go and look up the original charters and state constitutions and read what they said. Here are a few more examples of the Puritan effect on centuries of Americans. In 1648, the New England Synod of Churches defined the duties of citizens, the functions of civil government, and the nature of civil government like this: "God, supreme Lord and King of all the world, has ordained civil magistrates to be under him, over the people, and for his own glory and the public good. And to this end has armed them with the power of the sword for the defense and encouragement of them that do well, and for the punishment of evildoers." They secondly said, "It is lawful for Christians to accept and execute the office of magistrate when called thereunto, in the management whereof, as they ought especially to maintain piety, justice, and peace, according to the wholesome laws of the commonwealth. So for that end they may lawfully now under the New Testament wage war upon just and necessary occasions." And one more from that says, "It is the duty of the people to pray for magistrates, to honor their persons, to pay them tribute and other dues, to obey lawful commands, and to be subject to their authority for conscience sake." The Great Law of Pennsylvania from 1682 was the first legislative act in Pennsylvania, and it said, "Whereas the glory of God Almighty and the good of mankind is the reason and the end of government, and therefore government itself is a venerable ordinance of God, there shall be established laws as shall best preserve true Christian and civil liberty, in opposition to all unchristian, licentious, and unjust practices, whereby God may have his due, and Caesar his due, and all the people their due from tyranny and oppression." Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence, among many other things, declared, "The only foundation for a republic is to be laid in religion. Without this there can be no virtue, and without virtue there can be no liberty, and liberty is the object in life of all republican governments." John Adams once described Roger Sherman. Roger Sherman was a major player in the Revolution, and he signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. He described Roger Sherman as an old Puritan, as honest as an angel and as firm in the cause of American independence as Mount Atlas. The Constitution of the State of Tennessee in 1796 stated, "No person who denies the being of God or a future state of rewards and punishments, meaning heaven or hell, shall hold any office in the civil department of this state." The Constitution of the State of Mississippi echoed the very same language in 1817. The Constitution of the State of New Hampshire required senators and representatives to be part of the Protestant religion until 1877. These laws and constitutions are just an example of what was very common throughout the first 300 years of America's colonies and United States. But Americans today will argue separation of church and state at every single mention of Christianity, the Bible, or Protestantism. And this brings me to the controversial idea of Christian nationalism. Now, I want to start by saying that this term is not clearly defined in 2025. It can have very different meanings depending on who is speaking. And so I caution you when you discuss it or when you hear someone else discussing it to first define the meaning, because that will tell you what the person is intending. Nationalism is defined by the American Heritage Dictionary as devotion, especially excessive or undiscriminating devotion, to the interests or culture of a particular nation state. That is a problematic definition, in my opinion, especially when it says excessive or undiscriminating devotion to the culture of a particular nation state. I mean, the Nazis were nationalists, and so I hesitate to want to encourage any kind of nationalism. For comparison, patriotism is defined as love of and devotion to one's country. But back to the Christian nationalism definition. In my opinion, just using the term nationalism kind of muddies the waters of Christian nationalism. However, it is a term that is being used on a daily basis by multiple groups. And so I have come to see it in two ways. I think in today's culture, it can either mean, first, imposing Christianity on American citizens by means of legislation or force, which I have seen people use, or it can mean that the population is majority Christian in belief and practice, and the benefits of such practices influence all of society. The first meaning is not American, it's not Republican, and it's not constitutional. It might seem that the early Puritan colonists imposed Christian religion on their communities, but remember, they agreed in covenant to these rules. It was not imposed or forced by a ruler or elected official. Remember, they fled England because of that kind of force. The second meaning, the one I tend to gravitate toward, is what was the norm in the 1600s, 1700s, and into the 1800s. If you read the voluminous writings of the Puritan fathers, the colonial leaders, and the founding fathers of the Revolutionary era, they make it very, very clear that the church and family were the center of society, and they weren't just Christians in name only, but in devotion and practice in every facet of their lives. This naturally resulted in a culture that was much more virtuous than we see today. If you want some examples, I have more in my Knowledge Keeper series that plainly show this. One is called Virginia Tutor. It is the diary of a man who was a tutor to a wealthy plantation family in Virginia in 1771. And just reading diaries like this help you to see the Puritan effect. Another one is called Diary of a New York Girl, and it's a diary that spans 20 years in the 1800s of a girl. I believe she started her diary at 10 or 12 years old and kept it over the next 20 years. She talks about her Puritan grandmother, and you can just see again in her daily diary how the Puritan effect lasted all the way into the 1800s. I've got another one that's almost finished about a girl who was 11 years old in Boston and kept a diary in 1771 also for a year. You see this natural occurrence in the daily lives of ordinary people when you read their writings. So in the 16 and 1700s, it is evident that the Puritans covenanted together to build a society rooted in biblical principles. In the various colonies and settlements, members were required to profess and practice Christianity, but it was not a government that imposed these rules. It was covenant. It was community agreement. The members of each town and colony met together to write these covenants and the charters. And time again, they determined that a strong foundation in the Christian faith was the only sure remedy against chaos and failure. One funny example of this is that even in church services, which could last for several hours each Sunday, the tithing man in charge of poking and prodding those who nodded off during the sermon were employed by the church members themselves. The fruits of the Spirit in Galatians 5 are the natural result of walking in the Spirit, and that happens by choice and by self-discipline, studying the Scriptures and praying daily. Those fruits of the Spirit are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. This lifestyle was so natural to the colonial Puritans and to their descendants for many generations. They didn't practice a state religion that was enforced by law. They chose the Protestant Christian religion and agreed to hold each other accountable and to be held accountable. So I just want to recap a couple of major points from this podcast. Remember when David Barton quoted about the Great Awakening, he said, "The revival grew from families and towns outward to the nation, not from the nation inward to towns and families." And the strong relationship between the Christian religion and civil government was the normal practice in the colonies for generations. Friends, we don't want a nation where any specific religion is required or legislated, even the Christian religion. We want to keep exactly what the founders gave us in the Constitution and what was exemplified by the Puritans before them, a system of laws based on the morals and principles of the scriptures, enthusiastically embraced by the populace because the majority of Americans loved God with all their heart, soul, and strength. And how do we get that? We share the gospel with our friends, with our family members, with our neighbors. We teach our children just as the Pilgrims did, separate from the world, immersed in the scriptures with wisdom and knowledge, modeled after Proverbs 1. We give of our own means to care for the poor. We live by and model the 10 Commandments, the Shema found in Deuteronomy 6, and the greatest commandment that Jesus said, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. This Thanksgiving, I hope you will remember how deep our roots go and how much that first Puritan colony impacted the next 400 years and how we still benefit from it today. I hope you will be inspired to carry on their traditions in your family and community. I want to share with you a Thanksgiving unit study that I created last year. It's available to download on my website at nickitruesdale.com. This unit study is based on the primary source writings of William Bradford and the Mort's relation, the other pilgrims of the Plymouth colony. It is suitable for homeschool families of all ages, as well as co-ops, and it includes reading lists, video links, art study, craft activities, copy work, geography, vocabulary, and even suggestions for adding the history of the Pilgrims to your Thanksgiving celebration. So you can enjoy it all month long in November, which a lot of families do, or you can use it alongside any history curriculum when you are studying this time period in history. It's 58 pages. You can print it in black and white or color, and it's $10 on my website. And as I said before, I will list all the books mentioned in the description below. One more book in my Knowledge Keeper series that deals with the Pilgrims is this one, Miles Standish, the Puritan Captain. And so this is about the same Plymouth colony, but it focuses on him. And it's pretty easy to read because this one was written by a historian in the 1800s, but based very closely on all the writings of the Pilgrims. And I actually have a free study guide for this one on my website as well, just to make it an easy to use book in your homeschool. The book and study guide are suitable for all ages, and you can use it during the month of November, or you can just save it to use with any homeschool curriculum when you're studying the Pilgrims. So I hope you'll enjoy. Look at all the book lists in my description and get to know those primary source writings. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to my podcast today. If you want more content like this, you can go to my website at nickitruesdale.com. That's NICKITRUESDELL.com, and find me on Facebook, Instagram, and X. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.
You're listening to the Biblical Family Network.